During the middle of the 13th century, the Duchy of Upper Bavaria functioned as a vital inland node within the Holy Roman Empire, positioned between the established commercial centers of northern Italy and the emerging markets of the German interior. The Wittelsbach dynasty, having secured the ducal title, sought to transform this agrarian territory into a consolidated administrative state. This transition required the rapid accumulation of liquid capital to fund the construction of fortifications, the maintenance of a professionalizing bureaucracy, and the expansion of urban infrastructure. However, the prevailing feudal economy was primarily based on land tenure and agricultural yields, which lacked the flexibility needed for high-stakes political maneuvers and territorial acquisitions. The regional economy faced a structural constraint due to the strict adherence of the local Christian population to canon law, which explicitly prohibited the lending of money for profit. This theological barrier created a persistent shortage of credit, stalling the development of trade and the modernization of the state. To resolve this financial bottleneck, the Bavarian dukes issued formal invitations to Jewish merchant financiers from the more developed regions of the Rhineland and northern France. These individuals possessed the specialized expertise and international networks necessary to facilitate complex transactions and provide the credit facilities that the domestic population was legally barred from offering. By the 1250s, the Jewish community in Upper Bavaria was granted a specific legal status that bypassed the traditional feudal hierarchy. They were classified as direct subjects of the ducal treasury, a designation that ensured their security was tied directly to their fiscal contributions. This arrangement allowed the dukes to bypass the cumbersome consent of the landed nobility when seeking funds for military campaigns or diplomatic missions. The initial settlement patterns were highly strategic, with a ducal administration directing the new arrivals to settle in developing urban hubs like Munich and Landshut. These locations served as the primary conduits for the salt trade and the transit of luxury goods, areas where the injection of Jewish capital and credit could maximize tax revenues for the state. Consequently, the presence of the community was not a product of organic migration, but was a deliberate instrument of statecraft designed to modernize the Bavarian treasury and provide the ruling house with a permanent, reliable source of funding, independent of the agrarian cycle. The Jewish presence in 13th century Upper Bavaria was defined by the doctrine of imperial chamber serfdom. This framework established a direct, vertical relationship between the community and the sovereign, effectively removing them from the standard feudal order that governed the rest of the population. While the term serfdom usually implied agricultural labor and lack of mobility for the Christian peasantry, in this specific administrative context, it designated a unique form of royal property. Under this arrangement, the Jewish population was categorized as a perpetual asset of the treasury, granting the duke exclusive jurisdiction over their physical persons, their movements, and their accumulated wealth. This classification meant that the community lived entirely outside the common law and the traditional court systems utilized by the nobility or the townspeople. They were not subject to local municipal regulations or the authority of regional lords, but instead operated under a specialized system of ducal privileges. These privileges were not rights in the modern sense, but were revocable grants of protection issued by the monarch to safeguard his financial interests. Because the community was defined as belonging to the duke's chamber, any physical assault or theft directed against a Jewish individual was legally prosecuted as an attack on the duke's personal property. This created a powerful incentive for the central government to maintain public order, as any loss of Jewish life or capital represented a direct depletion of the state's liquid reserves. The Duke utilized this total legal control to transform the community into a flexible fiscal instrument. By standing outside the feudal hierarchy, the Jewish residents were immune to the military obligations and tithes that burdened other classes. But in exchange, they were subject to arbitrary and intensive taxation that could be levied at the Duke's discretion. This system allowed the Wittelsbach administration to extract emergency funding without the need for negotiations with the provincial estates. The logic of this status ensured that as long as the community remained a productive source of revenue, the state would uphold its protective mantle. However, this also meant that their residency was completely decoupled from any permanent legal standing, remaining entirely dependent on the immediate political and financial requirements of the ruling house. Consequently, the legal identity of the community was built upon a foundation of absolute sovereign whim, where their protection was merely a byproduct of their fiscal utility to the chamber. Gemini said, the economic landscape of 13th century Upper Bavaria was fundamentally shaped by the evolving doctrine of the Catholic Church regarding the sin of avarice and the practice of lending. During this period, ecclesiastical authorities tightened the enforcement of the prohibition on interest-bearing loans among the Christian laity, categorizing such transactions as a violation of natural law and a threat to the spiritual health of the community. This stringent moral regulation created a significant structural imbalance in a region that was rapidly transitioning from a barter-based system to a more complex monetary economy. As the demand for credit increased to support commercial expansion and the rising costs of municipal governance, the local Christian population found itself ideologically and legally disqualified from providing the necessary financial services. This institutional withdrawal of Christian capital created a void in the marketplace that was neither accidental nor temporary. The Wittelsbach administration recognized that the absence of a domestic credit market would lead to prolonged financial stagnation, hindering the ability of the state to mobilize resources for large-scale projects. By facilitating the entry of the Jewish community into this specific niche, the dukes effectively outsourced the financial risks and moral stigmas associated with money management to a group that operated outside the jurisdiction of canon law. This positioning allowed the Jewish population to act as the primary engines of liquidity, providing the essential capital required for the acquisition of new territories and the development of trade routes without endangering the religious standing of the Christian majority. The resulting economic structure was one of extreme specialization, where the Jewish community functioned as a surrogate financial class. This arrangement served the interests of the ducal treasury by ensuring that the movement of money remained constant despite the spiritual prohibitions that governed the rest of society. The commercial vacuum was thus filled by a group that possessed the technical knowledge of ledger management and currency exchange, skills that were not yet widely distributed among the agrarian or artisan classes of Bavaria. However, this total concentration of financial activity in a single, distinct minority meant that the entire mechanism of credit became synonymous with a non-Christian presence. This specific economic alignment ensured that the community was indispensable to the state's fiscal health, yet it also rendered them the sole visible target for any social or economic frustrations arising from the inherent complexities of a debt-based economy. During the second half of the 13th century, Munich emerged as the primary administrative and economic hub of the Wittelsbach domains, a development that necessitated a permanent and structured Jewish presence. The ducal administration facilitated the establishment of a dedicated residential district known as the Jewish Lane, situated in the northeastern quadrant of the city near the Marienplatz. This neighborhood was not merely a residential cluster, but a highly specialized urban zone designed to centralize the financial activities of the community under the direct supervision of the Crown. The architecture of this district was characterized by the construction of stone homes, which stood in stark contrast to the timber and wattle and daub structures that comprised the majority of the city's residential buildings. These stone houses were a physical manifestation of the significant capital concentrated within the community and were mandated by the need for fire resistance and structural security for the preservation of essential financial records and precious metals. The existence of these stone dwellings served as a permanent visual marker of the community's elevated economic status and their unique relationship with the Duke. In a medieval urban environment, stone was an expensive material reserved for the nobility, the clergy, and the highest strata of the merchant class. Its use by the Jewish population signaled their role as a vital auxiliary to the state treasury. However, This architectural permanence was paradoxical, as it simultaneously increased the physical vulnerability of the residents. The stone houses acted as a fixed target for social resentment, representing a concentration of wealth that was exempt from the standard municipal taxes and feudal obligations that burdened the Christian citizenry. While the thick walls provided a measure of protection against localized theft, they offered no defense against large-scale civil unrest or organized state seizure. Furthermore, the concentration of the community into a single, identifiable lane allowed for efficient monitoring by ducal officials. This spatial organization ensured that the movement of capital remained transparent to the sovereign, facilitating the collection of specialized taxes and the enforcement of residential restrictions. The stones of these buildings, though robust, symbolized a precarious form of sanctuary that was entirely dependent on the continued stability of the central government. As Munich grew in political importance, the Jewish lane became an island of fiscal utility within an increasingly hostile urban landscape. The very structures intended to safeguard the community and its assets ultimately served to isolate them, creating a geographic and social boundary that simplified the eventual administrative efforts to identify, contain, and extract wealth from the population during periods of political crisis. The fiscal relationship between the Wittelsbach dukes and the Jewish community in Upper Bavaria was defined by a calculated exchange of protection for liquidity. This administrative arrangement created a state of absolute dependency, where the safety of the minority was directly proportional to their continued capacity to fund the territorial ambitions of the ruling house. During the 13th century, the dukes were engaged in persistent efforts to consolidate their holdings and expand their borders against rival noble houses and the power of the church. These military and diplomatic endeavors required immediate and reliable access to coinage, a resource that the traditional agricultural economy could not produce with sufficient speed. The Jewish community, therefore, functioned as a strategic financial reserve that the Duke could tap into at any moment to secure the mercenaries, provisions, and political bribes necessary for state building. This dependency functioned as a metaphorical double-edged sword for the Jewish population. While the Duke provided a robust defensive perimeter against local violence and judicial interference from the lower nobility, this protection was strictly transactional. The sovereign did not view the community as a permanent component of the social fabric, but rather as a specialized tool for fiscal management. As long as the community maintained high levels of liquid capital and facilitated the transfer of wealth from the broader economy into the ducal treasury, their residency was enforced by the central government. However, this meant that any significant downturn in their financial productivity or any change in the state's financial architecture would immediately render their presence obsolete. The Duke's reliance on Jewish credit also allowed him to maintain a political advantage over his Christian subjects. By utilizing Jewish funds, the monarch could bypass the traditional requirement of summoning the provincial estates to request tax increases. This independence from the landed nobility strengthened the centralizing power of the Wittelsbachs, but simultaneously isolated the Jewish financiers. They became the visible agents of an increasingly intrusive and expensive state apparatus, bearing the social stigma of the taxes they helped collect and the loans they provided. The powerful sanctuary offered by the Duke was, in reality, a high-cost insurance policy. The community paid for its survival through a continuous cycle of extraction, knowing that the moment their capital was exhausted or their utility was surpassed by other financial sources, the protective barrier of the crown would be withdrawn, leaving them exposed to the long-standing resentments of a population that viewed them only through the lens of debt and financial obligation. The First Council of Lyons, convened in 1245 by Pope Innocent IV, served as a platform for the formalization of these restrictive policies. Although the council was primarily focused on the excommunication of Emperor Frederick II, its legislative output included significant provisions aimed at reinforcing the separation of religious groups. These decrees mandated that secular rulers enforce strict social distancing, preventing Christians from serving in Jewish households and prohibiting the public display of Jewish religious life. In Upper Bavaria, These directives began to erode the pragmatic administrative cooperation that had previously defined the relationship between the Wittelsbach court and the Jewish community. The echoes of Lyons reached the Bavarian domains through a series of increasingly assertive papal letters and provincial synodal decrees. The Church's objective was to dismantle the integrated nature of urban life, where Jewish and Christian neighbors often shared economic interests and physical spaces. By framing the presence of the Jewish minority as a source of potential spiritual contamination, the ecclesiastical hierarchy pressured the Duke to adopt a more confrontational stance. This shifted the social contract from one of utilitarian tolerance to one of supervised marginalization. The clergy argued that the protection of the Jewish community by secular lords was a violation of the superior moral authority of the Church, suggesting that the servitude of the chamber should be interpreted not as a privileged status, but as a condition of perpetual social degradation. Furthermore, the Council's influence promoted the idea that the political health of a Christian state was dependent on its religious purity. This intellectual shift provided the local Bavarian clergy with a theological mandate to interfere in what had previously been considered purely civil and financial matters. The resulting pressure forced the ducal administration to implement more frequent and invasive inspections of communal activities and to restrict the physical movement of Jewish residents during Christian festivals. These measures were not merely symbolic. They signaled that the Duke's protective authority was no longer absolute and was now being contested by a competing global power centered in Rome. As the influence of the Council of Lyons permeated the regional administration, the community became increasingly isolated, caught between the fiscal demands of the state and the escalating exclusionary requirements of the international church. This transition marked the beginning of the end for the period of relative stability, as the legal protections once provided by the Crown were systematically undermined by the new demands for a religiously segregated society. The year 1247 witnessed the emergence of a specific type of social destabilization in the Bavarian territories, often referred to in administrative records as the first major eruption of organized anti-Jewish hostility within the Wittelsbach domains. This crisis originated from the propagation of ritual murder accusations, a series of unfounded claims suggesting that the Jewish community engaged in the abduction and killing of Christian children for religious purposes. While these allegations lacked any empirical evidence, they served as an effective mechanism for mobilizing the urban peasantry and the lower artisan classes, whose economic frustrations were increasingly directed toward the Duke's financial agents. The resulting violence was not a spontaneous outburst of religious fervor, but a strategic response to the visible concentration of capital within the Jewish residential quarters. Duke Ludwig II faced a complex political dilemma during this period of unrest. As the primary protector of the Jewish community, he was legally obligated to suppress any internal violence that threatened his servants of the chamber. However, the Duke also recognized that the popular anger was deeply rooted in the heavy tax burdens and high interest rates that his own administration necessitated. To preserve the stability of the state and the legitimacy of his rule, the Duke adopted a policy of political deflection. Rather than addressing the underlying economic grievances of the Christian populace, he allowed the Jewish community to bear the full weight of public scrutiny. By treating the ritual murder accusations as a matter for specialized judicial inquiry rather than dismissing them as baseless, the Crown validated the fears of the public while maintaining its distance from the actual violence. This administrative strategy effectively transformed the Jewish minority into a buffer zone between the sovereign and his subjects. The community was utilized to absorb the social shocks of the transitioning Bavarian economy, allowing the Duke to continue his program of territorial expansion and fiscal centralization without facing a direct revolt from the nobility or the guilds. When the violence of 1247 escalated, the ducal response was characterized by a focus on the restoration of order rather than the protection of individual rights. The subsequent legal proceedings were used to extract further payments from the Jewish communal leadership in exchange for the reaffirmation of their safety. This cycle reinforced the precarious nature of the royal sanctuary, demonstrating that the Duke was willing to permit a regulated level of social hostility if it served to stabilize his political position and secure the continued flow of revenue to the treasury. Gemini said Duke Ludwig II, known in the historical record as the Stern, presided over Upper Bavaria with an administrative philosophy that prioritized the centralization of ducal authority and the meticulous expansion of the state's financial infrastructure. His governance was marked by a shift from traditional feudal management to a more rigorous, revenue-focused bureaucracy, designed to support his expensive military and diplomatic commitments within the Holy Roman Empire. To maintain his court and finance the construction of strategic strongholds, Ludwig II implemented a system of intensive fiscal extraction that targeted the groups most directly under his legal control. Central to this strategy was the regular imposition of tallages, arbitrary and non-negotiable taxes levied specifically upon the Jewish community as servants of the chamber. Under Ludwig's administration, these tallages evolved from occasional emergency requests into a structured and predictable mechanism for filling the ducal treasury. The duke's officials maintained detailed ledgers of Jewish assets, ensuring that the state could claim a significant portion of any profit generated through financial services. This increasing reliance on Jewish capital meant that the community was effectively treated as a living endowment of the Wittelsbach house. Ludwig's severity was reflected in his willingness to ignore local protests and ecclesiastical complaints as long as the Jewish population remained capable of delivering the liquid resources required for his political maneuvers. He viewed the protection he provided not as a moral duty, but as a maintenance cost for a vital state asset. The administrative planning of this period also involved the formalization of the Jewish community's role in the regional tax system. Because the Duke struggled to collect consistent revenues from the landed nobility, he utilized the Jewish financiers as fiscal intermediaries who could extract value from the economy and concentrate it in the royal coffers. This made the Jewish minority the most visible and consistent source of funding for the Duke's professionalizing army. However, this total integration into the Duke's financial apparatus meant that the community's fate was tied to the personal solvency of the monarch. As Ludwig II's expenditures continued to grow, the pressure on the Jewish population reached a saturation point, where the demand for capital began to outpace the community's ability to generate it. This fiscal exhaustion signaled a dangerous shift in the Duke's cost-benefit analysis, as the severe patron began to evaluate whether the political cost of protecting an increasingly drained population still aligned with his long-term administrative goals. Gemini said the financial structure of Upper Bavaria in the late 13th century was characterized by a profound indebtedness among the rural nobility and the urban patrician class. As the economy transitioned from localized agrarian production to a market-oriented system based on coinage, the Bavarian baronage found themselves in a state of chronic illiquidity. To maintain their social standing, fund their private local conflicts, and meet the increasingly heavy feudal demands of the Wittelsbach court, these lords relied extensively on loans provided by the Jewish community. Over several decades, this reliance transformed into a structural dependency, with a significant portion of the nobility's ancestral lands and future agricultural yields serving as collateral for these debts. This economic reality fostered a pervasive atmosphere of jealous hostility within the aristocratic ranks. The Bavarian lords viewed the Jewish financiers not merely as economic actors, but as instruments of their own financial ruin. Because the Jewish community operated under the Duke's direct jurisdiction, the nobility perceived these debts as a secondary form of taxation that bypassed their traditional privileges. The interest accrued on these loans was seen as a continuous siphon, transferring wealth from the established landed estates into the hands of a non-feudal minority that lived under the sovereign's protection. This resentment was exacerbated by the fact that as long as the Jewish creditors remained in the territory, the legal obligations of the debtors remained enforceable through the Duke's courts. By the mid-1270s, the Bavarian nobility began to recognize that a total expulsion of the Jewish community would offer an immediate and comprehensive solution to their insolvency. The removal of the creditors would effectively result in the dissolution of the debt records, providing the baronage with a massive injection of unencumbered wealth and the restoration of their lands. This realization shifted the political stance of the nobility from one of passive annoyance to active agitation for the removal of the Jewish presence. They began to frame the expulsion not as a matter of religious zeal, but as a necessary measure for the economic restoration of the Christian estates. Consequently, the Duke faced a coordinated front of powerful landholders who were no longer willing to tolerate the presence of the servants of the chamber. For the nobility, the physical excision of the Jewish population became a financial necessity, a means to achieve a grand debt jubilee that would stabilize their precarious social position at the expense of the state's primary financial agents. The arrival and proliferation of the Franciscan and Dominican mendicant orders within the urban centers of Upper Bavaria introduced a new ideological variable into the regional social hierarchy. Unlike the traditional monastic orders that remained isolated in rural cloisters, these friars established their convents in the heart of the developing cities, such as Munich and Landshut, where they engaged directly with the burgeoning merchant and artisan classes. Their primary objective was the systematic standardization of Christian belief and the elimination of what they categorized as religious error. Through the medium of public preaching, the mendicants shifted the popular perception of the Jewish minority from that of a fiscally useful administrative group to one of a spiritually dangerous presence that threatened the cohesion of the Christian community. The preaching of the friars utilized a sophisticated rhetorical framework to mobilize the urban populace. They did not focus on the technicalities of usury or the complexities of the ducal treasury, but instead emphasized the unbelief of the Jewish population as a moral stain upon the territory. By framing religious diversity as a source of divine displeasure, the mendicants suggested that the ongoing economic difficulties and social tensions within the cities were the direct result of the Duke's continued protection of a non-Christian minority. This intellectual campaign was particularly effective among the guilds, whose members were frequently indebted to Jewish creditors and were highly susceptible to arguments that blended economic grievance with theological duty. Furthermore, the mendicant orders acted as an informal intelligence network that linked the local Bavarian experience to broader European movements of intolerance. They brought with them the anti-Jewish polemics developed at the universities in Paris and Bologna, introducing localized versions of blood accusations and ritual desegregation theories. This specialized form of intellectual agitation provided a quasi-legal justification for the popular resentment that had previously been disorganized. The friars argued that the secular authorities had a religious obligation to prioritize the spiritual purity of the realm over the financial utility of the servants of the chamber. The constant presence of these orders in the public squares ensured that the exclusion of the Jewish community became a central theme of urban political discourse. Their influence effectively undermined the Duke's ability to maintain a neutral, revenue-based policy toward his Jewish subjects. By creating an atmosphere where tolerance was equated with religious betrayal, the mendicants prepared the psychological ground for the eventual expulsion. They transformed the physical neighborhood of the Jewish lane into a symbolic frontier of a cosmic struggle, ensuring that any future administrative action taken by the state would be met with enthusiastic support from a populace now convinced of the existential necessity of religious uniformity. Gemini said, "In the evolving political landscape of Upper Bavaria, the concept of the state began to shift from a collection of loosely affiliated feudal estates toward a centralized, religiously uniform entity. This period saw the emergence of an early form of ideological homogeneity, where the legitimacy of the Wittelsbach dukes was increasingly tied to their role as defenders of a unified Christian realm. Within this framework, the continued presence of a distinct Jewish minority was no longer viewed through the lens of economic utility, but was reclassified as a fundamental theological error. This intellectual transition suggested that a diverse population was an inherent weakness, a source of spiritual friction that prevented the duchy from achieving its full potential under divine favor. The administrative apparatus of the state began to adopt the language of religious purity to justify a more aggressive stance toward the Jewish community. This was not a sudden shift, but the result of a long-term convergence between civil law and ecclesiastical doctrine. Jurists and theologians alike argued that the internal unity of the realm was compromised by the existence of a group that did not share the dominant faith. They posited that the social body functioned like a biological organism, where any non-conforming element was treated as a foreign body that must be neutralized or excised to ensure the health of the whole. This conceptualization introduced a dangerous precedent. The idea that residency and legal protection were not based on historical contracts or fiscal contributions, but on adherence to a single religious identity. By the mid-1270s, this emphasis on homogeneity became a primary driver of state policy. The ducal court began to prioritize the creation of a pure Bavarian identity that left no room for the specialized status of the servants of the chamber. The Jewish presence was framed as a temporary anomaly that had served its purpose during the initial stages of territorial development, but had now become an obstacle to the final consolidation of the Wittelsbach domains. The belief that religious diversity was a threat to the political stability of the kingdom provided the necessary moral cover for the upcoming administrative actions. It allowed the state to characterize the impending expulsion not as a breach of previous legal protections, but as a necessary and virtuous act of purification intended to align the physical borders of the duchy with the spiritual boundaries of the church. Gemini said, "The year 1270 represents the definitive turning point in the administrative stability of the Jewish community in Munich, shifting the regional climate from one of managed tension to systemic persecution." The immediate catalyst was a specific ritual murder accusation involving a Christian child, a narrative that had circulated in other European territories but had not yet been utilized as a primary judicial engine in Upper Bavaria. Unlike previous vague rumors, this event was immediately seized upon by local agitators and leveraged to initiate a formal investigation into the conduct of the residents of the Jewish lane. This localized incident provided the state and the municipal authorities with a necessary pretext to bypass the traditional protections of the chamber and implement a rigorous program of systemic scrutiny. This transition allowed the ducal administration to move beyond simple fiscal extraction and toward a more intrusive form of political control. The accusation served as a legal doorway through which the state could justify the mass arrest of communal leaders and the comprehensive audit of all private and business correspondence found within the stone homes. This was no longer an issue of individual criminal liability, but was treated as a collective failure of the entire community, rendering every member legally suspect. The resulting environment of suspicion enabled the state to freeze assets and halt the collection of debts, effectively paralyzing the financial life of the minority. Furthermore, the 1270 accusation acted as a unifying force for the disparate groups that sought the removal of the Jewish presence. It bridged the gap between the theological objections of the mendicant orders, the financial desperation of the indebted nobility, and the physical aggression of the urban guilds. By framing the Jewish community as a lethal threat to the most vulnerable members of Christian society, the accusation removed the moral ambiguity of the Duke's protective stance. The event demonstrated that the legal status of the servants of the chamber was insufficient to withstand a coordinated assault on their social legitimacy. This systemic scrutiny created a permanent state of emergency, ensuring that the community would remain under constant judicial pressure until the final administrative decision to dissolve their residency was reached. The 1270 accusation was, therefore, the essential mechanism that converted long-standing social friction into an organized, state-led process of elimination. The judicial proceedings following the 1270 accusation in Munich introduced a period of specialized legal violence, where the state utilized advanced interrogation techniques to consolidate its case against the Jewish community. This phase represented a total suspension of the customary legal protections that had previously shielded the servants of the chamber from arbitrary physical coercion. The Wittelsbach administration, seeking to formalize the rumors of ritual crime into a documented legal reality, authorized the use of regulated forms of judicial torture. This was not a chaotic application of force, but a meticulous, state-sanctioned process designed to extract specific, self-incriminating narratives that would satisfy the evidentiary requirements of the medieval inquisitorial system. During these trials, the traditional secular protections, which generally required a high burden of proof and the presence of impartial witnesses, were bypassed in favor of a summary justice model. The use of the rack and other mechanical devices allowed the court to obtain confessions that linked the entire communal leadership to a wider conspiracy. These forced testimonies were then transcribed and archived, serving as permanent legal proof of the community's alleged inherent criminality. This process effectively stripped the Jewish minority of their status as protected subjects, reclassifying them as enemies of the public peace, whose presence was no longer compatible with the security of the state. The administrative utility of this specialized violence was profound. By securing legal confessions, the Duke could justify the immediate seizure of communal property and the suspension of all outstanding Christian debts to Jewish lenders without appearing to violate his own sovereign decrees. This judicial theater provided a veneer of legitimacy to what was fundamentally a massive asset transfer. The trials ensured that the transition from a protected financial class to a condemned criminal class was irreversible. Consequently, the legal identity of the Munich Jewish community was systematically dismantled within the courtroom, replacing their previous contractual standing with a permanent record of admitted guilt. This specialized legal violence served as the bridge between localized social hostility and the comprehensive statewide administrative action that would follow, ensuring that the eventual expulsion would be framed not as an act of fiscal opportunism, but as a necessary execution of a judicial sentence against a proven threat to the realm. The culmination of the 1270 judicial crisis in Munich resulted in a definitive act of lethal collective violence that fundamentally altered the demographic landscape of the city's northeastern quarter. Following the extraction of confessions through specialized legal mechanisms, the administrative and judicial tension transitioned into uncontained physical aggression. A large, coordinated mob, comprised of local guild members and urban laborers, converged upon the Jewish lane, bypassing the nominal protective measures of the municipal guard. The residents, recognizing the collapse of their traditional legal sanctuary, sought refuge within the synagogue, which as a stone structure was perceived to be the most defensible location against civil disorder. However, the attackers did not attempt to breach the doors through standard means, but instead utilized incendiary materials to initiate a deliberate conflagration. The building was surrounded and set on fire, ensuring that those inside were trapped within the structure. Historical records from the period, including local municipal chronicles and communal memorial lists, confirm that 68 individuals perished during this single event. This figure represented a significant portion of the city's Jewish population, including prominent communal leaders and financiers whose expertise had previously been essential to the ducal treasury. The destruction of the synagogue was not merely an act of religious desecration, but a calculated method of physical liquidation, removing the human presence while ensuring the total cessation of the community's social and economic activities. The role of the state during this massacre was characterized by strategic non-intervention. Despite the legal status of the victims as direct servants of the chamber, the ducal authorities failed to deploy military force to disperse the mob or extinguish the fire. This passivity indicated a significant shift in the sovereign's cost-benefit analysis. The political risk of suppressing a popular uprising in defense of a condemned minority now outweighed the fiscal benefits of their continued residency. In the immediate wake of the fire, the remaining structures in the Jewish lane were looted, while essential ledger books were destroyed, effectively erasing the documentation of numerous Christian debts. The burning of the synagogue thus served as a violent resolution to the ongoing judicial inquiry, replacing the slow process of trial with a swift and total excision of the community from the urban fabric of Munich. This event permanently shattered the illusion of security provided by stone architecture and royal decrees, marking the transition from regulated persecution to overt, state-sanctioned elimination. In the immediate aftermath of the 1270 violence, Duke Ludwig II entered a period of administrative hesitation, characterized by a conflict between his immediate financial requirements and the escalating demands of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Despite the significant loss of life in Munich, the Duke recognized that the total removal of the surviving Jewish population would result in a permanent disruption of the state's credit facilities. To mitigate the loss of revenue, Ludwig II attempted to stabilize the remaining communities in smaller urban centers like Landshut and Straubing, reasserting the economic utility of the survivors as a necessary buffer against the duchy's mounting debts. He understood that the Italian merchant bankers had not yet fully established the infrastructure required to replace the Jewish servants of the chamber as a primary source of liquid capital. However, this pragmatic attempt to maintain a skeleton financial staff was met with rigorous opposition from the Roman Curia and the local Bavarian episcopate. The Church argued that by continuing to protect the Jewish survivors, the Duke was obstructing the divine justice that the 1270 events had supposedly initiated. Papal legates emphasized that the secular authorities' first duty was the defense of the faith, not the preservation of fiscal assets. This ecclesiastical pressure was not merely rhetorical. It carried the threat of interdict and the potential release of the Duke's subjects from their oaths of fealty. Consequently, Ludwig's protective stance became increasingly untenable, as the Church framed his fiscal pragmatism as a form of spiritual negligence. The Duke's hesitation was also influenced by the internal political climate of the Wittelsbach court. While the treasury remained depleted, the political cost of defying the Church during a period of imperial instability was deemed too high. Ludwig II began to implement a series of compromised policies, allowing for the continued presence of a limited number of Jewish financiers, while simultaneously permitting the Church to increase its surveillance over their daily activities. This period of suspended animation saw the introduction of more aggressive ecclesiastical audits of Jewish ledgers, ensuring that any profit generated was heavily taxed by both the state and the local diocese. Ultimately, the Duke's attempts to balance these competing interests served only to delay the inevitable. The survivors lived in a state of constant legal and physical uncertainty, their residency no longer guaranteed by a robust sovereign decree, but subject to the shifting whims of a monarch under siege by his own religious advisors. By the mid-1270s, the administrative cost of maintaining this specialized minority began to outweigh the dwindling fiscal returns, as the Duke's severe patronage yielded to the overwhelming necessity of maintaining favor with the Catholic authorities. This phase of hesitation concluded when the Duke realized that the preservation of the community was no longer a viable strategy for state building, leading him to abandon his pragmatic defense in favor of a final, religiously sanctioned administrative cleansing. In 1275, the administrative policy of Upper Bavaria underwent a fundamental transformation with the promulgation of a comprehensive statute that targeted the core economic activity of the Jewish community. This legislative act was not an isolated decree, but a systematic dismantling of the financial framework that had allowed the servants of the chamber to function as a specialized class. The statute formally outlawed the practice of usury, or the lending of money for interest, across all Wittelsbach domains. By adopting this stringent interpretation of canon law into secular legislation, the Duke effectively prohibited the only commercial avenue that the state had previously encouraged and protected. This move was designed to align the duchy's legal code with the moral requirements of the Church, signaling that the era of fiscal pragmatism was being superseded by a mandate for religious and social conformity. The implementation of this law had an immediate and paralyzing effect on the community's distinct economic utility. Without the ability to charge interest, the Jewish financiers could no longer cover the high costs of the Duke's protection or the heavy tallages routinely extracted from their capital. The statute also mandated the immediate cessation of all current interest-bearing contracts, a move that provided the Christian nobility and urban patricians with a legal mechanism to default on their existing obligations. This was, in essence, a state-sanctioned dissolution of Jewish assets. The community was stripped of its primary professional function, leaving its members with no viable means of income within the rigid medieval guild system, which remained closed to non-Christians. Furthermore, the 1275 statute served as an administrative prelude to the final expulsion by rendering the Jewish presence fiscally redundant. As the community's ability to generate liquid capital vanished, so too did the Duke's motivation to maintain their specialized legal status. The legislation forced the Jewish population to attempt a transition into manual labor or petty trade, areas where they faced intense competition and physical hostility from the established Christian guilds. By removing the legal basis for their financial operations, the Wittelsbach administration ensured that the community would rapidly deplete its remaining reserves. This strategic impoverishment was a calculated step in the state-building process, ensuring that when the final decree of removal was eventually issued, the community would possess neither the political influence nor the financial resources to negotiate for their continued residency. The Statute of 1275 thus acted as the terminal blow to the social contract, replacing the double-edged sword of protection with a policy of institutionalized economic excision. Gemini said, in the final years of the 1270s, the Bavarian administration intensified the social isolation of the Jewish population by introducing visual markers of segregation. Following the restrictive economic measures of 1275, the state shifted its focus toward the public degradation of the community's social standing. This was achieved through the formal adoption of ecclesiastical clothing mandates into secular law, requiring every Jewish resident to wear a distinguishing badge on their outer garments, usually taking the form of a yellow circle or a specifically shaped hat. This marker served as a permanent, visible signal of the wearer's religious identity and legal status. This policy transformed the Jewish minority into a group of legally recognizable outsiders, ensuring that they could be identified instantly by any member of the Christian majority. The implementation of the badge was a strategic move to enforce the total social separation demanded by the mendicant orders and the Roman Curia. It effectively criminalized anonymity, making it impossible for Jewish individuals to move through the public squares or marketplaces without attracting immediate scrutiny. By marking the community in this manner, the state institutionalized a hierarchy of permanent inferiority, where the Jewish subjects were visually equated with other marginalized groups, such as lepers or penitents. This was not a symbolic gesture, but a practical tool for administrative control. It simplified the enforcement of residency restrictions and allowed municipal guards to monitor the boundaries of the Jewish lane with absolute precision. Furthermore, the badge functioned as a psychological mechanism to desensitize the Christian populace to the impending removal of the community. By stripping the Jewish residents of their individuality and reducing them to a singular, marked category, the state prepared the public to view them as a foreign element rather than as fellow townspeople or neighbors. The visual mark became a lightning rod for localized harassment, and as it signaled to the urban guilds and laborers that the wearers no longer enjoyed the full dignity or protection of the sovereign. This period of symbolic excision ensured that the Jewish community lived in a state of constant public exposure and vulnerability. The badge served as a physical manifestation of the shattered social contract, indicating that the state no longer viewed the community as a collection of specialized financial agents, but as a population whose visibility was maintained only for the purpose of systematic exclusion and eventual elimination from the Bavarian realm. In the final months preceding the formal decree of removal, the Wittelsbach administration initiated a phase of systematic scrutiny aimed at the complete documentation of Jewish assets across Upper Bavaria. This process was a transition from periodic taxation to a state-managed inventory of all movable and immovable property held by the servants of the chamber. Ducal commissioners were dispatched to Munich, Landshut, and smaller regional hubs to seize communal and private ledgers, ensuring that every outstanding loan, property deed, and cache of precious metal was registered with the central treasury. This administrative audit was designed to prevent the concealment of wealth and to ensure that the state would be the sole beneficiary of the impending displacement. The scrutiny extended to a rigorous verification of all financial contracts. The state officials examined the promissory notes held by Jewish lenders, not to facilitate their collection, but to identify the specific Christian debtors whose obligations could be transferred directly to the Duke. This systematic mapping of debt enabled the Crown to prepare a comprehensive portfolio of assets that would remain in Bavaria after the population was gone. By freezing the ability of Jewish residents to sell their homes or transfer their capital to relatives in other territories, the government created a closed system of fiscal entrapment. The stone homes that once represented a secure investment were reclassified in the ducal records as future state property, awaiting only a final executive order to be vacated. Furthermore, this period of administrative cleansing involved the mandatory registration of all religious artifacts and library contents within the synagogues. While these items held immense cultural and spiritual value for the community, the state viewed them through a strictly material lens, evaluating the weight of silver ornaments and the market value of parchment. This meticulous preparation ensured that the eventual expulsion would not be a chaotic event, but a managed liquidation of an entire social class. The government's objective was to achieve a frictionless transition where the Jewish population would depart with only the most basic personal necessities, leaving the infrastructure of their economic life entirely intact for royal acquisition. This systematic scrutiny signaled the final collapse of the legal protections once afforded by the Wittelsbach House, as the Duke's role shifted from a protector of useful agents to a receiver of a bankrupt estate. The community was thus reduced to a series of entries in a royal ledger, their human presence already erased by the cold efficiency of the state's fiscal preparations. The final stage of the Jewish community's displacement from the Wittelsbach domains was accelerated by the arrival of specialized merchant bankers from northern Italy. These financiers, often originating from centers like Florence and Siena, introduced a new financial architecture that fundamentally transformed the Bavarian state's fiscal operations. Unlike the local Jewish lenders who operated on a fragmented domestic scale, the Italians were part of expansive international networks that utilized sophisticated credit instruments. Their presence provided the Duke with a more robust and flexible source of revenue, by effectively rendering the specialized intellectual capital of the resident Jewish population redundant. The state no longer had to rely on a localized minority when it could tap into a global system of capital management that functioned with greater efficiency and larger reserves of liquidity. These Italian firms brought with them advanced accounting techniques and the use of bills of exchange, which allowed for the transfer of funds across great distances without the physical movement of precious metals. This capability was particularly attractive to the Wittelsbach court as it sought to interact with the broader European economy and the Roman Curia. Because these bankers were Christian, their activities were often categorized as legitimate commercial transactions rather than sinful usury, provided they utilized specific contractual loopholes like late payment penalties or currency exchange fees. This allowed the Duke to secure the necessary funding for his administrative and military projects while simultaneously satisfying the Church's demands for religious homogeneity. The moral and political friction associated with protecting the servants of the chamber was thus bypassed through the adoption of this foreign banking model. Furthermore, the integration of Italian capital allowed for a more centralized control of the regional economy. The Duke could negotiate large-scale loans directly with a few powerful banking houses rather than managing hundreds of individual contracts with local Jewish lenders. This shift simplified the state's financial bureaucracy and reduced the administrative burden of protecting a vulnerable minority. As the Italian financiers established permanent offices in the major Bavarian trade hubs, they began to absorb the market share once held by the residents of the Jewish lane. The specialized financial skills that had previously made the Jewish community indispensable were now mirrored and surpassed by these new actors. Consequently, the Wittelsbach administration viewed the Jewish population not as an essential asset, but as a vestigial component of an outdated economic system. The emergence of the Italian banking alternative provided the final structural justification for the expulsion, as the state secured its financial future by aligning itself with the rising power of international Christian capital. By the late 1270s, the administrative priorities of Duke Ludwig II reached a state of total alignment with the exclusionary mandates of the Catholic Church. This period marked the resolution of the long-standing tension between the state's fiscal pragmatism and the papacy's requirement for spiritual homogeneity within Christian territories. The Duke's earlier hesitation, driven by the need for liquid capital, was resolved as the political and religious costs of maintaining a non-Christian minority became insurmountable. The Wittelsbach court recognized that the consolidation of a centralized Bavarian state required the absolute support of the episcopate, which viewed the Jewish presence as a fundamental contradiction to the ideal of a unified, holy realm. This convergence turned the Jewish community into a shared political obstacle for both secular and religious authorities. The final policy shift was characterized by the synchronization of secular law and canon law. The Duke adopted the Church's stance that the physical presence of unbelief was a source of social instability and divine disfavor. In exchange for his cooperation in the expulsion of the Jewish population, the Church provided the Duke with significant political concessions, including the legitimization of certain tax levies on the clergy and the affirmation of Wittelsbach territorial claims. This transaction transformed the act of expulsion into a joint venture of state-building and religious purification. The state's earlier role as a powerful sanctuary was permanently discarded in favor of a new identity as the secular arm of the Church's mission to enforce universal Christian standards across the duchy. Furthermore, this alignment allowed the Duke to frame the seizure of Jewish assets as an act of pious restoration. By stripping the community of its property and legal standing, the state claimed to be returning ill-gotten wealth to the Christian community, thereby resolving the social friction caused by decades of debt. The administrative machinery of the duchy was repurposed to ensure that the removal of the Jewish residents was conducted with the full blessing of the ecclesiastical courts. This ensured that no legal or moral challenges could be raised against the Duke's actions. The final agreement between church and state removed the last remaining barrier to a religiously uniform Bavaria, as the fiscal utility of the minority was officially replaced by the political utility of a pure and compliant Christian citizenry. This convergence ensured that the Jewish community was no longer a subject of negotiation, but a target of a unified institutional effort to achieve a monolithic social and religious order. The administrative culmination of the Wittelsbach anti-Jewish policy was the issuance of a meticulously managed royal decree in 1276, which mandated the total and immediate removal of the Jewish population from the domains of Upper Bavaria. This document was the first of its kind in the region to move beyond localized or temporary restrictions, of establishing a permanent and territory-wide ban on Jewish residency. The decree functioned as a terminal legal instrument that officially dissolved the status of the servants of the chamber, stripping the community of any remaining rights to domicile, property ownership, or legal recourse. It was drafted not as a response to a specific crime, but as a comprehensive executive action designed to complete the transition to a religiously uniform state apparatus. The logistics of the 1276 expulsion were handled with rigorous bureaucratic precision to ensure that no capital escaped the reach of the ducal treasury. The decree specified a strict timeline for departure, often granting residents only a few days to settle their affairs and vacate their homes. Specialized royal agents were stationed at the gates of major cities like Munich and Landshut to inspect the belongings of those departing, enforcing a prohibition on the export of precious metals, coins, or valuable financial records. Any assets not specifically exempted by the Duke were declared forfeit to the Crown. This process ensured that while the human population was physically removed, the infrastructure of their wealth remained entirely within the state's control. providing a massive one-time injection of resources into the Wittelsbach coffers. Furthermore, the decree included provisions that prohibited any future re-entry into the duchy under penalty of imprisonment or death. To prevent the continuation of financial activities from across the borders, but the law invalidated all outstanding debts owed to Jewish lenders that had not already been settled. This effectively served as a final cancellation of the nobility's liabilities, securing the political loyalty of the debtor class. The 1276 order also mandated that all synagogues and communal buildings be converted to secular or ecclesiastical use, often serving as warehouses or municipal offices. This total administrative erasure ensured that the Jewish community would leave no physical or legal footprint behind. By the end of the year, the execution of the decree had achieved its primary objective, the complete demographic and fiscal liquidation of a minority that had once been the cornerstone of the Duke's financial strategy. The execution of the 1276 decree was accompanied by a comprehensive program of property sequestration that targeted the total liquidation of the Jewish estate. This process was not a disorganized looting, but a state-managed operation directed by the ducal chancellery. Upon the announcement of the expulsion, all Jewish-owned assets were placed under immediate arrest, preventing any unauthorized transfer or sale of property. Royal officials were empowered to enter private residences and communal buildings to conduct exhaustive inventories, marking every item of value for state acquisition. This sequestration transformed the former Jewish quarters into a massive financial reservoir for the crown, ensuring that the departure of the population resulted in the maximum possible gain for the royal treasury. The sequestration focused heavily on the recovery of movable wealth, particularly the vast quantities of silver and gold that had been accumulated through decades of financial activity. Specialized weighmasters were appointed to evaluate jewelry, ritual objects, and coinage, which were then melted down and re-stamped with the Duke's mark. Furthermore, the state asserted control over all outstanding business ledgers. By seizing these account books, the administration obtained a complete map of the regional credit market. The Duke's agents meticulously reviewed these documents to identify high-value debts that could be extracted directly from the Christian populace. This allowed the state to act as the new creditor, demanding payment for loans that were originally contracted with the now exiled residents. Immovable property, including the stone homes and urban garden plots, was subjected to a different form of administrative absorption. These structures were not demolished, but were reassigned to the municipal governments or gifted to loyal members of the Wittelsbach court. The registration of these properties involved the formal cancellation of existing deeds and the issuance of new titles in the name of the sovereign. This systematic turnover of real estate provided a permanent solution to the city's housing needs, while simultaneously rewarding the political allies who had supported the Duke's exclusionary policies. The final stage of the sequestration involved the disposal of communal assets, such as hospitals and cemeteries. These sites were often repurposed for public infrastructure or sold to the church, with the proceeds being funneled back into the military budget. By the time the process was complete, the Bavarian state had successfully internalized the entire economic output of the Jewish community. The mechanics of this seizure ensured that the minority left the territory with nothing but the clothes on their backs, while the Wittelsbach house emerged from the crisis with its debts cleared and its financial reserves significantly replenished. The physical removal of the Jewish population from Upper Bavaria in 1276 was executed through a series of forced marches coordinated by the regional bailiffs and municipal guards. This phase of the administrative cleansing required the movement of entire family units, including the elderly and the infirm, from urban centers toward the territorial frontiers. The state provided no transportation or provisions for these columns, placing the burden of survival entirely on the displaced individuals. Because the Duke's decree had already stripped them of their pack animals and carts during the sequestration phase, the majority of the exiles were forced to travel on foot, carrying only the minimal personal effects that had been exempted from state seizure. The practical difficulties of this exodus were compounded by the rigid timeline imposed by the Wittelsbach Chancellery. The departure routes were strictly dictated by the military, funneling the population toward specific border crossings into neighboring territories such as the Bishopric of Salzburg or the lands of the Habsburgs. These checkpoints became sites of extreme administrative friction, as the neighboring lords were often reluctant to absorb a destitute population that lacked the financial assets to pay for new residency permits. Consequently, hundreds of people were frequently stranded in the neutral zones between jurisdictions, where they lacked legal protection from any sovereign. The Bavarian guards ensured that once a group crossed the frontier, they were legally barred from returning, effectively creating a one-way corridor of displacement. The logistical planning also accounted for the risk of private violence against the marchers. While the Duke sought an orderly removal to ensure that the transition did not descend into a broader civil disturbance, the lack of a protective escort meant that the columns were vulnerable to local brigands and hostile rural populations. These security failures often resulted in the loss of the few remaining personal items the exiles possessed. Furthermore, the march occurred during a period of significant regional instability, where roads were poorly maintained and bridge tolls were high. Those unable to pay the passage fees were often detained or forced into hazardous detours. By the time the last groups reached the borders of the duchy, the demographic profile of the community had been shattered by the physical toll of the journey. The logistics of the 1276 departure thus functioned as a final filter, ensuring that the human remnants of the Jewish community were physically severed from the Bavarian realm as thoroughly as their financial records had been erased. Following the physical departure of the Jewish population, the Bavarian state initiated a comprehensive program of architectural and historical revisionism. This phase focused on the permanent alteration of the built environment to ensure that the Jewish presence left no lasting imprint on the urban topography. The primary target of this administrative effort was the network of synagogues and communal buildings that had served as the centers of Jewish life. These structures, often the most prominent buildings in their respective quarters, were subjected to immediate conversion into Christian sacred spaces. In Munich and other regional hubs, synagogues were consecrated as chapels or parish churches, a process that involved the removal of all Hebrew inscriptions and the installation of altars and bells. This physical transformation served as a visible symbol of the total victory of the dominant faith over the unbelief of the former residents. The destruction of infrastructure extended to the cemeteries, which were treated as sources of raw material for municipal expansion. Headstones were uprooted and repurposed as building blocks for defensive walls, bridge foundations, and the flooring of new administrative offices. This systematic desecration was not merely a byproduct of neglect, but a calculated act of historical revisionism. By integrating the markers of Jewish memory into the literal foundations of the Christian city, the state effectively buried the evidence of the community's long-standing residency. The removal of these burial grounds eliminated the physical link between the Jewish people and the Bavarian soil, ensuring that future generations would view the territory as having always been a monolithic Christian domain. Furthermore, the municipal records began to reflect a revised narrative of the duchy's economic development. The previous contributions of Jewish financiers to the ducal treasury were omitted from official chronicles, replaced by accounts that emphasized the independent growth of the Christian merchant class and the fiscal wisdom of the Wittelsbach house. This erasure of specialized intellectual capital from the public record was essential for legitimizing the new financial system managed by the Italian banking houses. The state also renamed the streets and lanes of the former Jewish quarters, stripping away any linguistic reminders of the previous inhabitants. By the end of the century, the architectural and archival purging was so thorough that the Jewish community was relegated to a marginal footnote in the official history of the realm. This destruction of infrastructure ensured that the expulsion was not just a demographic shift, but a total elimination of a competing cultural and historical narrative from the Bavarian landscape. The expulsion from Upper Bavaria did not lead to an immediate resettlement in adjacent territories, as the neighboring regional authorities implemented a series of restrictive measures to prevent an influx of destitute refugees. Following the total sequestration of assets by the Wittelsbach treasury, the displaced population lacked the financial resources necessary to purchase new residency rights or provide the security deposits typically required by medieval municipal councils. Citing economic distress and the fear of localized inflation, the administrators of the bishoprics of Freising and Regensburg, as well as the nearby Austrian duchies, frequently closed their gates to the columns of exiles. This policy was based on a pragmatic calculation. Without the ability to offer credit or pay high communal taxes, the refugees were viewed as a purely extractive burden on the local food supply and social services. The refusal to grant entry was often formalized through municipal ordinances that explicitly prohibited the housing of itinerant foreigners from the Bavarian lands. These laws were designed to protect the interests of the local merchant guilds, who feared that a sudden increase in the population would destabilize the fixed prices of essential goods and labor. Furthermore, the neighboring lords were wary of complicating their diplomatic relations with Duke Ludwig II. Accepting his expelled subjects could be interpreted as an endorsement of their presence, potentially leading to jurisdictional disputes over unresolved debt claims. Consequently, the border guards were instructed to maintain a policy of active denial, forcing the refugees to remain in the unincorporated territories between the duchies where they lacked legal standing. This closure of the gates also reflected a broader shift in the regional management of marginalized groups. The neighboring territories began to coordinate their border policies to ensure that the problem of the landless remained confined to the roads. By branding the refugees as a source of social contagion and economic instability, the local authorities justified the use of force to drive the columns toward more distant frontiers, such as the northern Italian city-states or the Kingdom of Bohemia. The lack of a centralized imperial policy on displacement meant that each local ruler could prioritize their own territorial insulation over the humanitarian needs of the exiles. By the late 1270s, the Bavarian refugees found themselves in a state of permanent transit, their survival threatened not only by the loss of their homes, but by an international administrative consensus that prioritized fiscal protectionism over the traditional laws of hospitality. This systematic rejection ensured that the expulsion was not a simple relocation, but a process of ongoing social and economic fragmentation. The administrative aftermath of the 1276 expulsion was defined by the Crown's systematic acquisition and aggressive collection of the financial records left behind by the Jewish community. While the human population had been removed, the archival evidence of their economic transactions remained under the direct control of the ducal chancellery. These debt records, comprising thousands of individual promissory notes and loan contracts, were treated as a primary state asset. The Duke's officials did not nullify these obligations for the benefit of the Christian population. Instead, they enacted a policy where the Crown legally substituted itself as the creditor. This ensured that the Wittelsbach house remained the ultimate beneficiary of the expulsion, while absorbing the interest and principal that would have previously been paid to the residents of the Jewish lane. The process of collection was managed with a level of bureaucratic vigor that far exceeded the capabilities of the original lenders. Royal bailiffs were provided with copies of the seized ledgers and dispatched to the estates of the nobility and the homes of urban patricians to demand immediate settlement. Because these debts were now classified as ducal property, any refusal to pay was treated as a direct challenge to the sovereign's authority rather than a private civil dispute. This legal reclassification removed the debtor's ability to negotiate for lower interest rates or extended deadlines. The state utilized its monopoly on force to ensure compliance, by frequently resorting to the temporary seizure of livestock or agricultural equipment from landholders who lagged in their payments. Furthermore, the management of these records allowed the Duke to exert new forms of political leverage over the Bavarian baronage. By holding the physical evidence of their insolvency, the Crown could trade debt forgiveness for military service or political concessions, effectively turning the servants of the Chamber's former capital into a tool for centralized control. The administration also established a specialized office within the Treasury to audit the records for any hidden assets or collateral that had been overlooked during the initial sequestration. This aggressive collection policy ensured that the economic vacuum created by the departure of the Jewish community was immediately filled by the state. The debt records thus served as a bridge between the old feudal economy and a more modern, revenue-focused autocracy, where the Duke used the remnants of the Jewish estate to fund the professionalization of his court and the expansion of his territorial influence. The material consequence of the 1276 expulsion was an immediate and profound contraction of the Bavarian urban economy, characterized by a sudden disappearance of liquid capital from the regional markets. While the Duke had successfully seized the physical assets and debt records of the Jewish community, the removal of the financiers themselves destroyed the specialized credit infrastructure that had sustained local commerce for decades. The urban centers, particularly Munich and Landshut, experienced a period of economic stagnation as the flow of short-term loans used by artisans and small-scale traders was severed. Without the constant circulation of coinage provided by the former residents of the Jewish lane, the velocity of trade slowed significantly, leading to a visible decline in the volume of goods exchanged at the weekly markets. This stagnation was exacerbated by the lack of a functional replacement for the domestic lending system. Although the Italian banking houses were beginning to manage large-scale ducal finances, they generally avoided the high-risk, low-value loans required by local guild members and petty merchants. This gap in the financial architecture meant that the middle tier of the Bavarian economy was effectively starved of the capital necessary for maintenance and expansion. The construction of new stone buildings in the cities halted, and the maintenance of public infrastructure began to falter as the tax revenues derived from Jewish commercial activities vanished from the municipal budgets. The material void left by the community resulted in a deflationary environment where the scarcity of money lowered the value of agricultural produce while increasing the cost of manufactured goods. Furthermore, the cessation of Jewish financial activity led to a period of institutionalized insolvency among the lower nobility who had relied on continuous refinancing to maintain their households. While the Duke's aggressive collection of former debts provided a temporary influx of wealth for the central treasury, it simultaneously drained the remaining reserves of the rural estates. The lack of available credit meant that many landholders could no longer afford to invest in agricultural improvements or military equipment. This systemic illiquidity transformed the social landscape of Upper Bavaria into one of rigid economic preservation rather than growth. By the late 1270s, the administrative triumph of the expulsion had revealed its heavy cost, a paralyzed urban economy, and a regional market system that had lost its most dynamic source of investment. The duchy remained in this state of fiscal exhaustion until the new international banking networks could be fully integrated into the local commercial fabric. The successful execution of the 1276 decree inaugurated an era of complete ethno-religious homogeneity that fundamentally redefined the social composition of Upper Bavaria for several centuries. By removing the Jewish minority, the Wittelsbach administration achieved a state of institutionalized uniformity that aligned the demographic reality of the duchy with the ideological requirements of the medieval church. This transition was not merely a temporary absence of a specific group, but the establishment of a rigid social order where citizenship and legal standing were strictly tied to Christian baptism. The previous existence of a protected specialized class was replaced by a monolithic citizenry whose loyalty was predicated on shared religious observance and adherence to a single moral code. This period of homogeneity was maintained through a series of preventive legal frameworks designed to block the re-entry of non-Christian elements. The municipal statutes of major cities were revised to include permanent clauses that prohibited the granting of residency permits or trade licenses to individuals of Jewish descent. These laws ensured that the administrative cleansing of the late 13th century remained a permanent feature of the Bavarian landscape. Consequently, the urban centers evolved into culturally closed systems where the guilds, the municipal councils, and the ecclesiastical authorities functioned without the internal friction previously caused by the presence of a distinct religious minority. The absence of diversity allowed for the consolidation of a highly standardized regional identity, rooted in the rituals and cycles of the liturgical calendar. Furthermore, the state utilized this uniformity to strengthen its centralized control over the population. Without the need to manage the specialized legal status of a protected minority, the ducal bureaucracy could focus on the standardization of taxes and the enforcement of universal social norms. The lack of cultural competition meant that the church could exercise an unchallenged monopoly over education, public discourse, and social welfare. This enforced consensus contributed to a sense of regional stability, as the potential for intercommunal violence or judicial disputes involving different legal systems was effectively eliminated. The memory of the previous heterogeneous society was gradually replaced by a narrative of a pure and ancient Christian heritage. This state of social and religious isolation persisted until the Enlightenment and the Napoleonic era, when external political pressures finally forced the reopening of the Bavarian borders. For nearly 500 years, however, the 1276 expulsion served as the foundation for a territory that defined its security through the total exclusion of the religious other. The displacement of the Jewish population from Upper Bavaria in 1276 led to the emergence of fragmented diaspora communities in the neighboring territories of Austria, Bohemia, and the northern Italian city-states. These new settlements were not formed as cohesive units, but as scattered groups of refugees who integrated into existing Jewish quarters that operated under different legal and fiscal frameworks. The Bavarian exiles brought with them a distinct communal memory and specialized professional skills, yet they faced the immediate challenge of navigating a secondary layer of foreign residency status. In regions like the Duchy of Austria under the early Habsburgs, the arrivals were often categorized as guest residents, a designation that limited their ability to own land, but permitted them to resume small-scale trade and artisan labor. In Bohemia, the influx of Bavarian refugees contributed to the expansion of the urban centers, where the local administration recognized the utility of their experience in the regional silver trade. These exiles preserved their traditions in fragmented forms, often maintaining separate prayer customs or linguistic nuances that identified their origin within the larger Jewish population. However, the lack of a centralized Bavarian communal leadership meant that these traditions were increasingly absorbed into the local rites of their host territories. The survivors focused on the reconstruction of essential social infrastructure, such as burial societies and educational circles, which served as the primary vehicles for maintaining a sense of continuity. Despite their physical distance from Munich and Landshut, the exiles preserved the knowledge of the Bavarian legal environment, which would later prove essential during the rare periods of temporary re-entry in the following century. The administrative legacy of the Munich exiles in these new territories was characterized by a transition from specialized state servants to a more precarious existence as urban laborers. The high-level financial expertise that had once defined their status in the Wittelsbach court was rarely utilized in the more established banking environments of the Bohemian and Austrian capitals. Instead, the diaspora focused on the preservation of communal records and genealogical lists, ensuring that the names of those who perished in the 1270 fire were remembered within the liturgy of the new synagogues. This fragmented memory acted as a safeguard against the total erasure of their historical presence in Bavaria. While the state-sponsored revisionism in their former homeland sought to remove them from the official record, these diaspora communities functioned as living archives, maintaining a cultural and social link to the Bavarian landscape that the Wittelsbach decrees could not reach. By the late 13th century, the Bavarian Jewish identity had been transformed from a territorial reality into a dispersed, urbanized heritage, shaped by the experience of loss and the necessity of structural adaptation. The expulsion of 1276 in Upper Bavaria was not an isolated aberration of medieval justice, but a fundamental component of a recurring governance strategy utilized in the consolidation of the territorial state. This event demonstrated that the sovereign's protection was a temporary administrative contract rather than a permanent legal right. By analyzing the progression from the 1270 judicial violence to the final decree of removal, it becomes evident that the Wittelsbach administration utilized the Jewish minority as a flexible financial instrument. When the community's specialized utility was surpassed by more advanced banking networks, the state systematically dismantled their legal status to facilitate a total asset transfer. This pattern of excision allowed the monarchy to resolve its fiscal deficits and secure political internal stability without disrupting the core structures of Christian society. The 1276 events established a precedent for the use of managed crises to achieve long-term administrative goals. The state's ability to transition from a protector of useful agents to the executor of a condemned class provided a template for future institutionalized purges. This strategy ensured that the central authority could unilaterally redefine the boundaries of citizenship and residency whenever the cost of maintaining a marginalized group outweighed its economic contributions. The expulsion served as a primary mechanism for state building, and as it integrated the previously autonomous financial sector into the direct control of the royal treasury. By erasing the Jewish presence, the Bavarian administration successfully created a monolithic social and religious order that enhanced its centralized power. Ultimately, the 1276 expulsion proved that the medieval state functioned through a cycle of utilization, demonization, and liquidation. The administrative logic that drove the removal of the Jewish population was the same logic that governed the professionalization of the court and the standardization of regional law. The pattern of excision was an essential tool for creating a uniform political landscape, ensuring that no specialized minority could hold significant leverage over the sovereign. The success of this strategy in Bavaria influenced the governance models of neighboring regions, as other rulers recognized the fiscal and political benefits of a homogeneous territory